Hey everyone, tonight we're uncovering the greatest religious conspiracy hiding in plain sight. Not a cover-up, but a 1,000-year deception so successful that billions of Christians unknowingly pray to pagan gods every single day. Before we begin, hit like if you're ready to discover how the church didn't destroy the old gods, but gave them Christian name tags. And let me know in the comments if you've ever felt there was something ancient lurking behind your favorite saint. Now dim those lights and settle in. We're about to explore how Christianity's triumph over paganism was actually paganism's greatest victory. A masterful infiltration that turned every cathedral into a temple, every saint into a spirit, and every prayer into an offering to deities older than Christ himself. Now, without further ado, let's begin. The oak stands ancient in the grove, its bark scarred by 10,000 offerings. Blood has darkened its roots. Silver coins nest in the hollows of its trunk like sleeping eyes. The druids are coming through the mist, their white robes moving like ghosts between the trees, and they carry fire in clay bowls that smell of human fat and sacred herbs. This is Ireland, before the cross cast its shadow across the land, before saints replaced spirits, before the old gods learned to hide. The druids know their gods by name and deed. Lu of the long arm, whose spear never misses its mark. The Morrigan, who appears as crow and crone and beautiful woman, tasting victory on her lips before the battle begins. Bridget of the forge and well, whose breath kindles fires and whose tears become springs. These are not distant deities dwelling in marble temples. They walk the hills, they speak through the wind, they bleed when the sacred groves are cut. In the great stone circles of Ireland, the Tuatha De Danann, the divine tribe, still hold court. They are the people who came before people, who ruled before kings, who will endure after kingdoms crumble. The stones remember their footsteps. The barrows hold their treasure. The mounds mark the places where the worlds grow thin, where a mortal might slip between the human realm and the realm of the ever-living. Across the grey waters, in the forests of Germania, different fires burn under different stars. Here, Odin hangs himself from the world tree for 9 nights and 9 days, trading his eye for wisdom, his flesh for the secret names of power. The Aesir, his war gods, feast in halls built from the bones of giants. They know that winter is coming. They know that the world will end in fire and ice. But they sharpen their swords anyway, because what matters is not victory, but the courage to fight when all hope is lost. Thor's hammer strikes the anvil of the sky. Lightning splits the darkness. The Germanic tribes hear his laughter in the thunder and know their crops will grow strong. In their sacred groves, the priests hang offerings from the branches, swords and shields, and sometimes men, their bodies swaying in the wind like strange fruit. The trees drink deep, the gods grow strong. But the Aesir are not alone in their realm. The Vanir, the old fertility gods, remember when the world was younger, when Freya ruled the seasons, and Freya commanded the wild magic that makes seeds sprout and women conceive. These are the gods of earth and growth, of harvest and hearthfire. When the 2 divine tribes went to war, the world shook. When they made peace, they exchanged hostages. The war gods learned the secrets of growing things. The fertility gods learned the taste of battle blood. Further east, where the rivers run dark through endless forests, the Slavic peoples know gods that German and Celt have never dreamed. Perun rides the storm clouds, his beard crackling with electricity, his axe splitting trees and tyrants alike. Mokosh spins the threads of fate in her underground halls, her fingers wet with the water that flows beneath all things. The Domovoi, house spirits, live behind the stove, keeping homes safe from evil, turning milk sour when offerings are forgotten. These are gods of the deep wood and the long winter, gods who know that survival depends on respect for the powers that sleep beneath snow and stone. In every Slavic home, the household gods keep watch. They are ancestors who never quite departed, spirits who remember being human but have transcended human weakness. They demand bread and salt, beer and honey. In return, they guard against sickness, fire, thieves, and the walking dead. The line between the living and the divine is thin here, permeable, crossed with ritual and reverence. South and west, where the Mediterranean laps against marble shores, Rome builds its empire on the backs of 1,000 conquered gods. But Rome knows something the northern tribes are only beginning to learn. Gods can be adopted, adapted, absorbed. The Lares watch over the crossroads. The Penates protect the pantry. In every Roman home, gods gather around the hearth like family members, demanding daily bread and wine, offering protection and prosperity in return. These are intimate deities, personal gods, spirits who care about the price of grain and the health of children and the faithfulness of spouses. The Romans understand that gods are useful. Jupiter rules the sky, but also the affairs of state. Mars commands both war and the spring planting, for what is agriculture but warfare against hunger? Vesta tends the sacred fire that must never be allowed to die, for if it fails, Rome itself will fall. The gods are not abstractions. They are civil servants in the celestial bureaucracy, each with specific duties, specific jurisdictions, specific needs. And everywhere, in every tribe, every kingdom, every village that ever feared the dark, the gods are local. The god of this river is not the god of that mountain. The spirit that guards this grove has never set foot in that forest. The ancestors who watch over this clan would not recognize the blood right of another family. Religion is not a matter of universal truth, but of particular power, specific to place and people and the turning of the seasons. In Celtic Ireland, the sacred wells bubble up from underground realms where the Sidhe, the fairy folk who were once gods, still hold their revels. Each well has its own guardian, its own rituals, its own price. The water that heals a broken bone in County Cork might strike a man blind in County Clare. Power is local. Knowledge is inherited. The gods belong to those who know their names. In Germanic lands, the sacred groves stand separate and distinct. The oak that receives Woden's sacrifice would reject an offering meant for Thor. The ash tree that shelters the village spirits would wither if confused with the elm that guards the boundary stones. Each deity dwells in a specific place, accessible through specific rites, responsive to specific people who have inherited the right to call their names. Among the Slavs, the forest spirits know their territories down to the last fallen log. The Rusalka who haunts this bend in the river has never swum in those rapids upstream. The Leshy who rules this stretch of woodland would war against any spirit that dared cross into his domain. The old gods do not share. They do not compromise. They rule absolutely within their boundaries and not at all beyond them. This is the world before the missionaries arrive with their single god, who claims dominion over all lands, all peoples, all times. Before the churches rise where the sacred groves once stood, before the saints learn to wear the masks of older powers. In this world, power flows through bloodlines like an underground river. The druids inherit their knowledge from druids. The Germanic priests learn the secret names from their fathers and grandfathers, who learned them from theirs. The Slavic wise women pass down the chants and charms that have protected their people since the world was young. Religion is not a choice, but a birthright, not a belief, but a way of being in the world. The gods demand much. They are jealous, wrathful, hungry for sacrifice and praise. But they give much in return. They make the crops grow and the herds multiply. They grant victory in battle and children in the marriage bed. They heal the sick and curse the enemies of their people. They are present, personal, powerful. They listen when their names are called in the old language, spoken with the old authority. In the great stone circles, in the sacred groves, in the household shrines where bread and wine feed the ancestors every night. The old gods feast on the devotion of their people. They grow strong on sacrifice. They laugh at storms and mock death. They believe, as their worshippers believe, that they will endure forever. The missionaries are already walking the Roman roads, carrying a different message, serving a God who tolerates no rivals. But that is a story for tomorrow's telling. Tonight, the old fires burn bright. Tonight, the old gods are still strong. Tonight, the sacred groves echo with languages that will soon be silenced, prayers that will soon be forgotten, names that will be written on no Christian tongue. The oak stands ancient in the grove, its bark scarred by 10,000 offerings. Blood has darkened its roots for 1,000 years. It will darken them for only a few years more. The druids are coming through the mist, their white robes moving like ghosts between the trees. They do not know they are walking toward their last ritual. They do not know their gods are already learning new names, new faces, new ways to survive in a world that will soon forget the old paths. The mist closes around them like a shroud. The fire burns low in their clay bowls. In the distance, barely audible above the wind, church bells are beginning to ring. The letter arrives on parchment that still smells of the monastery scriptorium, its ink dark as dried blood. Pope Gregory the Great dips his quill again, considering his words carefully. The year is 601 AD, and somewhere across the grey waters, Augustine of Canterbury waits for instructions on how to handle the pagan temples that dot the English landscape like infected wounds. Gregory writes slowly, each word a calculated blow. Do not destroy the temples of the idols. Destroy only the idols themselves. Sprinkle the buildings with holy water. Build altars. Place relics inside. Let the people continue to gather in the places they have always gathered, but let them gather now in the name of Christ. The quill scratches against parchment. The candle flame wavers. In a few lines of Latin, the Pope has authored the death warrant of 1,000 gods, not through execution, but through transformation. He signs his name with a flourish. The letter will travel for weeks across dangerous roads, but the strategy it contains will reshape the spiritual landscape of Europe for 1,000 years. The old gods will not die. They will learn new names. Augustine receives the letter in his monastery cell on a morning when frost covers the English soil like a promise of winter. He reads it 3 times, his lips moving in silent prayer. The Pope's wisdom is clear. The people cannot be separated from their sacred places overnight. But sacred places can be redirected. He begins that very day. The first temple Augustine claims stands on a hill where the Saxons have worshipped Woden for centuries. The sacred oak at its center has been fed with blood and gold, mead and the breath of dying warriors. Its roots drink deep from the soil of the old faith. Augustine does not cut it down. Instead, he hangs a cross from its branches like fruit from a poisoned tree. The Saxons gather at dawn to watch this strange ritual. They expect thunder. They expect Woden's ravens to tear the monk's eyes from his skull. They expect the earth to crack open and swallow the blasphemer whole. Instead, Augustine sprinkles holy water on the altar stones and begins to sing in Latin. His voice carries across the hill like incense, foreign but not entirely unpleasant. The temple becomes a church. The oak becomes a Christian symbol. The altar stones, once slick with sacrificial blood, now hold bread and wine. The Saxons come to Sunday service because this is where they have always come to meet their gods. They kneel where their grandfathers knelt. They pray where their grandmothers prayed. Only the names have changed. Woden does not strike Augustine dead, but perhaps Woden is learning to listen to a different name. Across the Irish Sea, where the mist never quite lifts and the ancient stones remember older songs, the transformation takes a different shape. St. Patrick stands in the Druid's grove, his staff planted in soil that has been sacred since the world was young. The Druids have come to challenge him, their robes white as bone, their eyes holding the cold light of stars. They speak words in the old tongue that make the air shiver. They call down fire from a clear sky. They transform their staffs into serpents that writhe across the ground like living shadows. Patrick watches without fear. When they finish their display, he raises his own staff. The serpents become wood again. The fire gutters out. The air grows still. "Your gods are not false," he tells them in their own language. "They are incomplete." He speaks of Lu, the god of skill and craft, whose light shines across every battlefield. But Lu, he says, is only a reflection of the true light, the light that has shone since before the first dawn. He speaks of Brigid, the goddess of forge and well, whose flames kindle inspiration and whose waters heal all wounds. But Brigid, he says, serves a higher power, the source from which all healing flows. The Druids listen. They are scholars as well as priests, and they recognize truth when they hear it, even when it comes wrapped in foreign words, spoken by a man whose god claims dominion over all other gods. One by one, they convert. But conversion, they discover, does not mean abandonment. Lugh becomes Christ, the light of the world. Brigid becomes Saint Brigid, patroness of smiths and poets and sacred wells. The festivals continue, but they honor new names. The sacred fires still burn, but they burn for different reasons. The gods do not die, they put on new faces. In the forests of Germania, Saint Boniface raises his axe above the sacred oak that has stood since before memory began. The Germanic tribes gather to watch their world end. This tree has weathered 1,000 storms. Its acorns have fed their pigs. Its shade has sheltered their councils. Its branches have held the bodies of their greatest warriors as offerings to the storm god Donar. Boniface brings the axe down once, twice, 3 times. The oak groans like a dying giant, its trunk splitting with sounds like thunder. It falls across the sacred grove, crushing the altar stones, its branches reaching towards earth instead of sky. The tribes wait for Donar's vengeance. They wait for lightning to strike Boniface dead. They wait for the earth to swallow him up, for his blood to water the soil where the sacred tree once stood. Nothing happens. Donar is silent. The sky remains clear. Boniface stands in the wreckage of their oldest shrine, unharmed, victorious. The Germanic tribes see the truth written in fallen branches and shattered stone. Their gods have been defeated. But Boniface is wiser than his legend suggests. From the wood of the fallen oak, he builds a chapel. He tells the tribes that Donar was not destroyed, but transformed, not defeated, but elevated. The thunder god they worshipped was a shadow of the true God, whose voice speaks in every storm, whose power rules every tempest. They can still pray for protection from lightning, but they must pray to the source of all storms, not merely one of its manifestations. The chapel rises where the oak stood. The Germanic tribes come to worship there because it is where they have always come to speak with the powers that rule thunder and rain. The God they pray to has a new name, new scriptures, new rituals. But when storm clouds gather, they still seek shelter in the sacred place. They still ask the Master of Lightning to spare their homes. Thor's hammer still strikes the sky, but the hand that wields it belongs to a Christian God. Further east, where the endless forests stretch toward the rising sun, Prince Vladimir of Kiev stands at the crossroads of his kingdom's spiritual future. The year is 987 AD, and emissaries from 3 faiths compete for his soul and for the souls of all his people. The Muslim ambassador speaks of paradise and the unity of Allah. The Jewish envoy tells of the covenant between God and his chosen people. The Christian missionary describes the glory of Byzantium, the majesty of Hagia Sophia, the power of Christ who died and rose again. Vladimir listens to all 3, but the decision, when it comes, is not theological, but practical. His people have always worshipped many gods. The Orthodox Christianity of Byzantium allows for many saints. The theological leap is smaller than it appears. The old gods of the Slavs become the new saints of the Orthodox Church. Perun, the thunder wielder, becomes Saint Elijah, who commands storms and rain. Mokosh, the Earth Mother, becomes the Virgin Mary, protector of women and guardian of the harvest. The household spirits, the domovoi who keep homes safe and families fed, become Orthodox saints who respond to candles and incense, who bless marriages and protect children. The churches rise in Kyiv, their golden domes glittering like earthbound stars. But in the countryside, the transformation is gentler, more gradual. The peasants come to church on Sunday, crossing themselves before icons that echo older images. They pray to Saint Elijah when thunder rumbles overhead, asking for rain for their crops. They leave offerings at the shrines of the Virgin Mary, placing bread and honey before her icons as their grandmothers once placed bread and honey before the shrines of Mokosh. The prayers are different, the language is different, but the relationship between the human and divine remains the same. Intimate, local, personal. The saints watch over specific villages, specific families, specific needs. They listen to prayers spoken in Slavic tongues. They respond to rituals that blend Christian theology with pre-Christian practice. Double faith, duvovery, takes root in Slavic soil, like seeds scattered by an indifferent wind. The priests from Byzantium preach the official doctrine. But in the wooden churches that dot the landscape like mushrooms after rain, peasants burn candles to saints who remember being gods, who remember the taste of mead and honey cakes, who remember when their names were older and their power was less constrained by theology. The old gods do not die. They learn new prayers. Across Europe, the pattern repeats with variations subtle as dialect, profound as the shift from winter to spring. In Gaul, the Druids become Christian bishops, trading white robes for purple vestments, but keeping their authority over sacred wells and healing springs. The goddess Sequana, who blessed the waters of the Seine, becomes Saint Sequana, patroness of river commerce and healing springs. Her priests still gather offerings from those who seek healing, still bless boats that travel her waters, still speak prayers over the sick who come to bathe in her sacred river. In the mountains of Romania, where the forests grow thick and the wolves sing lamentations to the moon, Zalmoxis, the Thracian god who died and rose again, becomes Saint Zamolxa. His underground paradise becomes the Christian heaven. His promise of immortality to the faithful becomes the doctrine of eternal life through Christ. The sacred caves where his priests once initiated the worthy become Christian hermitages, where monks seek union with the divine. In the far north, where the sun disappears for months and the aurora paints the sky in colors that have no earthly names, the Sami shamans learn to cast their drums into sacred fires. But the spirits they once summoned do not disappear, they become angels. The reindeer spirits that guided hunters become Saint Elias, who watches over travelers. The bear spirit that granted courage becomes Saint Michael, who protects warriors. The old rituals continue in new forms, spoken in different languages but carrying the same intent, to bridge the gap between the human and divine, to secure protection and blessing from powers greater than mortal understanding. The transformation is not always peaceful. In some places, the old gods resist. In Lithuania, the sacred groves burn for decades. The priests of Pacunas, the thunder god, fight pitched battles against Christian missionaries, their sacred serpents writhing in the flames of burning temples. But even here, even in defeat, the old gods find new homes. Pacunas becomes Saint Elijah. The sacred oak groves become Christian monasteries. The serpent priests become monks who illuminate manuscripts with images that echo older symbols, older powers. The old gods are dying. The old gods are being born again. The distinction becomes meaningless as the years pass and the generations turn over like pages in a book written in languages both dead and living. By the time the last pagan temple falls, By the time the last druid speaks the last ritual in the old tongue, by the time the last Germanic tribe accepts baptism in rivers that once ran red with sacrificial blood, the work is complete. But it is not the work that the first missionaries imagined when they set foot on pagan soil with crucifixes in their hands and fire in their hearts. The gods have not been destroyed. They have been absorbed, adapted, transformed. They wear new names like new clothes. But underneath the Christian vestments, their hearts still beat with older rhythms. They have learned to listen for prayers in Latin and Greek, but they still remember their names in Celtic and Germanic and Slavic. The churches rise where the temples stood. The bells ring where drums once thundered. The saints smile from icons where gods once glared from crude stone carvings. But the power remains. The relationship between mortal and divine continues. The need for protection, for blessing, for intercession in a world that is dangerous and uncertain and shot through with mysteries that reason cannot penetrate. That need finds its answer in new forms, but with old intentions. Augustine's church stands on the hill where Woden's temple once welcomed warriors home from battle. On Sunday mornings, the descendants of Saxon kings gather to take communion. They kneel where their ancestors knelt. They pray where their ancestors prayed. They ask for the same things their ancestors asked for: victory over enemies, prosperity for their families, protection from the darkness that waits beyond the circle of human understanding. The God they pray to has a different name. But perhaps names matter less than the listening. Perhaps the divine speaks in whatever language the human heart uses to call out across the void. The letter that Pope Gregory wrote in 601 AD lies forgotten in monastery archives, its parchment yellow with age, its ink faded to brown. But its wisdom has taken root across a continent. The old gods live on, wearing Christian names, blessing Christian altars, listening to Christian prayers. They have learned to hide in plain sight. They have learned to survive. The Council of Tours convenes in the summer of 567 AD. Its bishops gathered in a stone hall that still smells of fresh mortar and sanctified wine. Outside, the French countryside bakes under a sun that has watched empires rise and fall, that has witnessed the last gasps of Roman paganism and the first tentative steps of Christian dominance. The bishops have come to solve a problem that threatens the very foundation of their new faith. The people will not abandon their festivals. Bishop Euphronius rises from his wooden chair, his vestments rustling like dry leaves. His voice carries the authority of Rome, but his words acknowledge a more ancient power. The people gather at the old times, he says. They light fires when the sun dies in winter. They dance when spring returns to the earth. They feast when the harvest comes home. We cannot stop them, but we can redirect their devotion. The scribes bend over their parchment, their quills scratching out the future of European spirituality. What they write in that stone hall will echo through centuries, will reshape time itself, will transform the very rhythm of human existence. They are not just organizing church doctrine. They are stealing the calendar from older gods and giving it to Christian saints. The work begins with winter. In the deepest darkness, when the Roman year holds its breath and waits for the sun's return, the Germanic tribes have always gathered around great fires that burn through the longest nights. They call it Yule, the wheel of the year turning toward light again. They burn logs the size of fallen trees, drink mead from horns carved with runic prayers, tell stories of Balder's death and promised resurrection. For 12 nights, the veil between worlds grows thin. The dead visit the living. The gods walk among mortals. Magic crackles in the winter air like frost. The bishops do not try to stop Yule. Instead, they place the birth of Christ at its very heart. December 25th becomes Christmas, not because Scripture demands this date, but because the people already gather when winter reaches its deepest point. the Yule log becomes a symbol of the light of Christ burning in darkness. The 12 nights of Yule become the 12 days of Christmas. The feasting and gift-giving continue, but they honor the Christ child instead of the dying and returning God of the northern forests. St. Nicholas takes the place of Odin, the gift-giver who rode through winter skies on his 8-legged horse, dropping presents down smoke holes for children who had been good. Nicholas rides through Christmas night on a sleigh instead of a horse, but he still watches to see who has been naughty or nice. He still rewards the virtuous and warns the wicked. He still brings light and joy to the darkest season. The transformation is so complete that within generations, no one remembers that Christmas trees were once Yule trees, that Christmas gifts echo older offerings, that Christmas carols carry melodies first sung to gods whose names are written in no Christian book. Spring brings its own challenges, its own opportunities for theological appropriation. In Ireland, the ancient feast of Imbolc marks the moment when winter's grip begins to loosen, when the first lambs are born and the first snowdrops push through frozen ground. It is Brigid's Day, the goddess of fire and metalwork, of poetry and childbirth, of sacred wells and inspiration. Her festival burns bright in the February cold, promising that warmth will return, that life will triumph over death, that the dark months will pass. The Christian calendar places Candlemas at the same moment, February 2nd, the feast of the purification of the Virgin Mary. The candles blessed on this day will burn through the coming year, carrying sacred light into dark corners, protecting homes from evil, marking the rhythm of prayer and worship. Mary takes Brigid's place as the protector of women, the guardian of sacred fire, the source of inspiration and blessing. But the deeper transformation happens to Brigid herself. She does not become a demon or disappear into folklore. Instead, she becomes Saint Brigid of Kildare, an Irish nun whose life mirrors the goddess she replaces. Saint Brigid tends a sacred fire that must never be allowed to die. She protects smiths and poets. She blesses wells and grants inspiration. Her feast day falls on February 1st, Imbolc Eve, when the goddess once walked the earth and spring stirred in winter's heart. The people light their Candlemas candles and pray to Saint Brigid for the same blessings their ancestors sought from the goddess. The fire still burns, the prayers still rise, the power still flows from divine to mortal, bridging the gap between human need and divine grace. Only the name has changed. Summer solstice, midsummer, when the sun reaches its greatest power and the earth swells with life, becomes the feast of St. John the Baptist. The bonfires that once honored the solar deities now burn for the forerunner of Christ. Young people still leap over the flames for luck and fertility. Herbs gathered on Midsummer's Eve still hold their greatest power for healing and protection. Wells and springs still grant their most potent blessings when the sun stands highest in the sky. But John the Baptist has taken the place of Balder and Apollo, of Lugh and Sol Invictus. The saint who baptized Christ becomes the Christian face of solar power, the human representative of divine light. His feast day, June 24th, falls precisely when the old sun festivals burned brightest. The people gather at the same times in the same places, for the same reasons. They seek blessing from the powers that govern light and warmth and the growing of green things. They find it in a Christian saint who remembers being a pagan god. But it is at autumn's end that the most profound transformation takes place, where the veil between Christianity and paganism grows thinnest, where the old gods most clearly show their faces beneath saintly masks. October 31st, Samhain, the Celtic New Year when the boundaries between worlds dissolve and the dead walk among the living. It is the night when spirits cross from the other world to visit the homes they once knew, when ghosts seek the warmth of familiar hearths, when the ancestors come home to feast with their descendants one last time before winter locks the earth in sleep. The Druids know this night well. They light great fires on hilltops, their flames visible for miles, beacons calling the spirits home. They carve faces in turnips and place candles inside, creating lanterns to guide the dead along dark paths. They set extra places at the dinner table, pour extra cups of ale, leave bread and meat for guests who cast no shadows and speak in voices like autumn wind. Christianity cannot absorb Samhain unchanged. The night is too wild, too dangerous, too saturated with powers that resist easy conversion. Instead, the Church splits it in two. November first becomes All Saints' Day, a celebration of the Christian dead who achieved paradise, the blessed souls who intercede for the living from their places in heaven. November 2nd becomes All Souls' Day, a time to pray for the dead who still await judgment, who need the prayers of the living to ease their passage through purgatory. The people light candles for the dead on both nights. They pray for deceased family members. They tell stories of saints and martyrs, of souls who suffered for faith and achieved eternal reward. But underneath the Christian veneer, the older rhythms persist. The candles still guide spirits home. The prayers still bridge the gap between living and dead. The boundary between worlds still grows thin when autumn dies and winter is born. All Saints' Day becomes the night when Christian saints are most present, most accessible to human prayer. All Souls' Day becomes the night when ordinary dead, grandparents and children, farmers and soldiers, visit the world they left behind. The wild spirits of Samhain are divided between holy saints and ordinary souls, tamed and categorized and made safe for Christian worship. But on the night between October 31st and November 1st, when mist rises from the graveyards and candles flicker in windows and the wind carries voices that belong to no living throat, the older powers still stir, the dead still walk, the ancestors still come home. The saints who replace the spirits remember, for one night each year, what they were before they learned Christian names. Across Europe, the pattern repeats with regional variations, local adaptations, cultural specifics that honor both Christian doctrine and pagan memory. In Germanic lands, the spring festival of Ostara, honoring the dawn goddess whose name survives in Easter, becomes the Christian celebration of Christ's resurrection. The eggs that once symbolized the return of life to a winter dead world become Easter eggs, painted and blessed and hidden for children to find. The rabbits that once served the fertility goddess become Easter bunnies, bringing chocolates and toys and the promise of spring's return. The feast moves through the calendar according to lunar calculations, but it always falls near the spring equinox, when day and night stand in perfect balance and the earth tips toward warmth and light. Christ's victory over death coincides with nature's victory over winter. The resurrection aligns with the resurrection of the green world. Christian theology and pagan symbolism merge so completely that they become indistinguishable. In Celtic lands, the harvest festival of Lughnasadh, honoring Lugh, the god of skill and craftsmanship, becomes Lammas, the blessing of the first bread made from the new grain. The competitions and contests that once honored Lugh continue as county fairs and harvest festivals. The blessing of tools and trades continues in guilds that place themselves under the protection of patron saints. Lugh himself becomes Saint Michael, the warrior archangel whose feast day falls in late September, when the harvest comes home and winter preparations begin. The May Day celebrations that once honored the Celtic fertility goddess Beltane are transformed into festivals of the Virgin Mary. The maypoles still rise, wreathed with flowers and ribbons. Young people still dance around them, weaving patterns that echo older rituals of fertility and blessing. But the prayers are addressed to Mary, Queen of Heaven, Mother of God, patroness of springtime and new life. Mary takes the place of all the fertility goddesses, Freya and Brigid, Diana and Cybele, Mokosh and Isis. She becomes the Christian face of feminine divine power, the acceptable channel for prayers that once went to goddesses too wild and powerful for patriarchal theology to contain. Her feast days dot the calendar like flowers in a garden, each one aligned with older festivals, older celebrations of feminine power and maternal blessing. The Assumption of Mary, August 15th, falls at the height of summer, when the Earth's fertility reaches its peak. The Nativity of Mary, September 8th, coincides with the harvest festivals that once honored the Earth Mother's generous provision. The Immaculate Conception, December 8th, sanctifies the darkest month with promise of divine light incarnating in human flesh. Through Mary, the feminine divine survives Christian conquest, domesticated but not destroyed, channeled but not eliminated. Peasant women still pray to the Mother Goddess for safe childbirth, successful harvests, protection from disease and disaster. They light candles before icons of the Virgin that echo older images of goddesses holding children. Goddesses surrounded by symbols of Earth's abundance. Goddesses crowned with stars and robed in the blue of infinite sky. Time itself has been conquered, claimed, Christianized. But time remembers its older allegiances. The calendar that emerges from centuries of theological appropriation bears the scars of its creation. Christian feast days cluster around the moments when pagan festivals once marked the turning of the seasons. Saints' days accumulate at the points where older gods once received worship. The rhythm of the Christian year follows the rhythm of the agricultural year, the cycle of death and resurrection that governs all life in the Northern Hemisphere. Workers still plant their crops according to saints' days that echo older agricultural festivals. Fishermen still watch for St. Elmo's fire. The electromagnetic phenomenon, once attributed to storm gods, now credited to a Christian martyr who protects sailors. Pregnant women still pray for easy labor to saints who remember being birth goddesses. Soldiers still wear medals of St. Michael, the war saint who replaced the war gods in Christian hearts, but kept their function in human affairs. The churches ring their bells to mark the hours of prayer, but the hours they choose echo older calls to ritual, older acknowledgements of sacred time. Matins sounds before dawn, when the old gods received their morning offerings. Vespers rings at sunset, when the ancient peoples lit their evening fires. Compline marks the deep night, when spirits walk, and the boundary between worlds grows thin. In monastery scriptoriums, monks illuminate manuscripts with images that blend Christian symbolism with pagan memory. Their borders writhe with green men, whose faces peer from foliage, with spirals and knots and interwoven patterns that predate Christianity by millennia. Their calendars mark feast days with pictures that echo older festivals, harvest scenes for autumn saints, spring flowers for Mary's feasts, winter fires for Christmas celebrations. The old gods live in the margins of Christian art, in the spaces between official doctrine and popular practice, in the gap between what theology teaches and what human hearts remember. They have learned to hide their power beneath acceptable symbols, to speak through saints' voices, to work through Christian miracles. The wheel of the year still turns. The seasons still cycle from death to life to death again. The people still gather at the sacred times to seek blessing from powers greater than human understanding. They still light fires against the darkness, still dance to welcome spring, still feast when the harvest comes home, still remember the dead when winter locks the world in sleep. The names have changed. The prayers are different. The buildings where people gather bear crosses instead of ancient symbols. But the need remains constant. To mark time's passage with ritual, to sanctify the seasons with ceremony, to bridge the gap between human need and divine power with festivals that honor both Earth's rhythms and heaven's promise. The bishops of Tours completed their work well. They did not destroy the pagan calendar, they baptized it. They did not eliminate the old festivals, they Christianized them. They did not drive the people from their sacred times, They taught them new names for ancient celebrations. The bells ring out across Christian Europe, marking the hours of a day that follows older rhythms, calling people to worship at times their ancestors chose for different reasons, but with the same intent. The calendar pages turn, marking feasts that honor saints who remember being gods, celebrations that blend Christian theology with pagan memory, holy days that sanctify time according to patterns older than Christianity itself. Time has been conquered. Time has been baptized. Time has learned to serve Christian purposes while remembering pagan origins. The wheel of the year turns on, carrying Christian saints where pagan gods once rode, marking sacred time with new names but ancient rhythms, counting down the days until the next feast, the next celebration, the next moment when heaven and earth draw close enough for mortals to touch the divine. The calendar of saints has become the new mythic year, but the myths it tells are older than the names it uses to tell them. Maria creeps through the trees, her bare feet silent on the forest floor, her arms full of offerings that would make the village priest cross himself 3 times and mutter prayers against witchcraft. Bread baked without salt, honey stolen from wild bees, a cup of kvass that has never touched Christian lips. She follows paths her grandmother taught her, paths that wind between worlds, leading to a clearing where time moves differently and the old spirits still accept worship. The sacred well bubbles up from depths that predate the church, predate the village, predate the memory of anyone living. Its water tastes of iron and earth and something else, something that reminds the tongue of older thirsts, older hungers. Maria kneels at its edge and whispers prayers in 2 languages. First in Church Slavonic, asking Saint Paraskiva to bless her coming child. Then in words older than Christianity, calling on Mokosh, the Earth Mother, to grant safe birth and healthy growth. She crosses herself. She pours honey into the water. She drinks 3 times and feels the power flow into her bones, into her blood, into the child growing beneath her heart. In the village church, she is a devout Christian woman who lights candles before icons and confesses her sins to the priest. In the forest, she is something older, a daughter of the earth spirits, a keeper of rituals that blend seamlessly with Christian practice. This is Dvoveri, double faith, and it flourishes in the soil of rural Christianity like mushrooms after rain. The bishops in Constantinople and Rome speak of theological purity, of doctrine uncorrupted by heathen practices. But their words carry less weight in the countryside than the wisdom of grandmothers who remember when the saints were younger, when their names were different, when their altars stood in groves instead of churches. The peasants listen to sermons on Sunday and follow older counsel the rest of the week. They know that saints were once spirits, that prayers can be addressed to multiple powers, that the divine speaks in whatever language the human heart uses to cry out for help. In the fields outside Novgorod, farmers plant their grain according to a calendar that layers Christian feast days over pagan agricultural wisdom. They plough on St. George's Day, April 23rd, because George the Dragon Slayer has inherited the role of spring's champion, the divine warrior who defeats winter's power and frees the earth for planting. But they also scatter grain at the field's 4 corners while whispering prayers to the domovoi, the household spirits who must approve of the crop if it is to grow strong. The priest blesses their ploughs with holy water and prayers to Saint Isidore, patron of farmers. But the farmers also leave bread and salt at the field's edge for spirits older than any saint, powers that ruled agriculture before Christ was born, that remember when humans first scratched furrows in virgin soil and prayed for the earth's blessing. The harvest follows the same double pattern. The grain is blessed in church before it is ground, consecrated to feed Christian bodies in Christian homes. But a portion is always set aside for older mouths, scattered in the forests for the wood spirits who protect the village boundaries. buried at crossroads for the dead who guard the paths between settlements, thrown into wells for the water spirits who determine whether crops will thrive or fail. Christianity provides the public face of faith, the official language of divine relationship. But in the shadows of official doctrine, older practices persist like underground rivers, feeding faith with nutrients that theology cannot provide. St. Paraskiva becomes the Christian name for Mokosh, the Earth Mother, but she retains the older goddess's functions and powers. Women pray to Paraskiva for fertility, for safe childbirth, for protection of children and livestock. Her icon shows her holding a cross, but the women who venerate her know she once held distaffs and spindles, symbols of the fate weaving that determines mortal destiny. Her feast days, October 14th and July 26th, cluster around the agricultural calendar's most critical moments, the final harvest and the height of summer growing. Women bring offerings to her shrines that echo older gifts, flax and wool for the goddess who taught humans to spin, honey and bread for the mother who feeds all living things. The church approves because Paraskiva was a Christian martyr who died for her faith. The women approve because she answers prayers with the same generosity as the earth goddess she replaced. The theological details matter less than the practical results. Children born healthy, harvests brought safely home, families protected from disease and misfortune. In the forests and mountains of Romania, where the Carpathians rise like ancient teeth against the sky and wolves sing songs that predate human language, the boundaries between Christian and pagan blur until they become meaningless distinctions. The wooden churches that dot the landscape like carved prayers bear crosses on their roofs and icons on their walls. But their foundations rest on stones that once anchored different altars, and their walls enclose spaces that remember older rituals. The villagers come to Sunday service with Christian names on their lips and Christian symbols around their necks. But they also carry amulets carved with symbols that belong to no gospel, tokens of protection that invoke powers older than any saint. In the mountains, Saint Elijah rides the thunderclouds, his chariot wheels rumbling across the sky, his horses breathing lightning. The Orthodox Church teaches that Elijah is a Hebrew prophet, taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, a forerunner of Christ who will return to herald the second coming. But the mountain peoples know him differently. They know he is Perun, the thunder god, wearing new clothes, but wielding the same power, commanding the same storms, demanding the same respect. When thunder crashes over the peaks and lightning splits the darkness, the villagers cross themselves and pray to Saint Elijah for protection. But they also leave bread and wine at mountain shrines that predate Christianity, offering tribute to the Stormbringer who could just as easily destroy their homes as water their crops. The prayer and the offering serve the same purpose: to establish relationship with powers beyond human control, to secure divine favor through ritual acknowledgement of human dependence. The caves that honeycomb the Carpathian Mountains echo with prayers spoken in multiple languages, addressed to deities wearing different names. Christian hermits occupy caverns that once housed pagan initiates, their cells carved into rock that remembers older ceremonies. They pray to the Trinity and the Virgin Mary, but the stones around them still vibrate with chants that invoked Zalmoxis, the Thracian god who died and was reborn, who promised immortality to those who followed his teachings. The hermits become saints in their own right, holy men whose prayers work miracles, whose bones heal the sick, whose spirits continue to bless the faithful after death. But their power flows through channels carved by earlier currents, divine streams that connect Christian sanctity to pagan mystery, without regard for theological boundaries. Further west, where the Celtic mists rise from sacred wells and ancient oaks still shelter offerings left by faithful hands, the transformation of spirits into saints reaches its most complete expression. Saint Bridget of Kildare tends a fire that has burned for 1,000 years, its flames maintained by nuns who inherited their duties from pagan priestesses. The sacred fire predates Christianity by centuries, but it burns now for a Christian saint who bears the exact name, functions, and feast day of the Celtic goddess she replaced. The theological transition is so seamless that most believers never notice it happened. The nuns who tend Brigid's fire perform rituals that echo older ceremonies, blessing wells with prayers that invoke the saint's power over water, blessing forges with invocations of her patronage over metalworking, blessing poets with appeals to her inspiration. But these are the same blessings the goddess once granted, channeled through Christian vocabulary, but retaining their essential character. The holy well at Kildare bubbles with waters that heal the sick and grant inspiration to those who drink with proper reverence. Pilgrims come from across Ireland to seek Brigid's blessing, leaving offerings that span the theological spectrum. Rosary beads and Christian medals alongside strips of cloth tied to sacred trees. Coins thrown into holy water beside flowers scattered on ancient stones. The saint and the goddess occupy the same space so completely that distinguishing between them becomes impossible. Brigid the Christian saint answers prayers with power that flows from sources older than any church. Brigid the Celtic goddess works miracles that conform to Christian expectations. The faithful receive blessings that satisfy both theological doctrine and spiritual need. Across the Irish countryside, the pattern repeats at hundreds of holy wells, sacred springs, and blessed pools. Each one bears a Christian saint's name, but each one remembers earlier dedications, older powers, pre-Christian relationships between human need and divine response. St. Colman's well heals eye diseases. St. Attractor's spring cures headaches. St. Brendan's pool blesses travellers. But beneath the Christian names, older spirits continue their ancient work, granting healing to the faithful, protection to the vulnerable, guidance to the lost. The saints provide acceptable names for unacceptable powers, Christian faces for pagan functions. The pilgrims who visit these sites understand the double nature of their devotions. They pray Christian prayers and light Christian candles, but they also perform rituals that predate Christianity, circling wells 3 times in the direction of the sun, leaving offerings of bread and flowers, drinking holy water, while making wishes that have nothing to do with salvation and everything to do with practical concerns like health, wealth, and love. In the Highlands of Scotland, where the mountains wear clouds like crowns and the lochs reflect skies that change their moods like living things, the clan spirits become Christian saints while retaining their fierce loyalties to specific families and territories. St. Columba protects the MacLeods from their ancient seat on the Isle of Skye, his power flowing through bloodlines that connect living clansmen to ancestors buried in sacred soil. The saint blesses the clan's battles, guides their ships through treacherous waters, guards their castles against enemies both human and supernatural. But he functions exactly like the clan spirits he replaced: protective, territorial, responsive only to those who share the proper blood or have earned the right to claim his protection. The clan banners bear Christian crosses, but they also carry symbols that predate any church: ravens and stags, boats and swords, emblems of power that connect the living clan to its mythic origins. The warriors who follow these banners into battle pray to St. Columba for victory, but they also invoke older names, older powers, older oaths sworn by ancestors who knew different gods. In the stone circles that dot the Scottish landscape, like prayers carved in granite, ancient rituals continue under Christian names. The stones remember when they marked sacred spaces dedicated to Celtic deities, when druids performed ceremonies that connected earth to sky, human to divine, past to future. Now they mark graves of Christian saints, chapels built to honor martyrs and missionaries, holy sites where the faithful gather to pray. But the stones still hold their power. They still mark places where the spiritual world presses close to the physical realm, where prayers reach their destinations more easily, where the divine responds to human need with unusual generosity. The people who gather there understand that sanctity has layers, that holiness accumulates like sediment, that Christian saints can inherit power from sources they never acknowledge. In medieval manuscripts illuminated by monks whose faith was unquestionable, pagan symbols writhe through the margins like living things. Green men peer from foliage that frames gospel texts. Celtic knots bind together pages that proclaim Christian doctrine. Dragons and ravens, stags and salmon, boars and wolves populate the borders of books dedicated to Christ and his saints. The monks who create these images work with conscious purpose. They understand that truth has many faces, that the divine speaks through symbols older than any creed, that human hearts respond to images that connect them to powers both ancient and eternal. They hide pagan wisdom in Christian art, preserve old knowledge in new forms, keep alive traditions that official doctrine cannot embrace but cannot afford to lose. In the carved capitals of Romanesque churches, similar images bloom like stone flowers. Faces of the green man stare down from pillars that support Christian arches. Celtic spirals wind around columns that uphold Christian altars. The masons who carve these images work in service of Christian patrons, but they inscribe older languages in their stone texts, older stories in their architectural narratives. The churches become libraries written in symbols, repositories of knowledge that spans theological boundaries. The faithful who gather for Christian worship stand surrounded by images that connect them to traditions predating Christianity, symbols that invoke powers older than any saint. The church building itself becomes a bridge between worlds, a space where Christian faith and pagan wisdom coexist in carved stone harmony. As centuries pass and generations turn over like pages in an endless book, the boundaries between Christian and pagan continue to blur until they become invisible to most observers. The peasants who follow both sets of practices see no contradiction in their double devotions. The saints who answer their prayers show no jealousy toward older spirits, who also receive offerings. The rituals blend so seamlessly that distinguishing between Christian and pagan elements becomes an academic exercise that has no relevance to practical faith. In Russia, the villagers paint Easter eggs with patterns that predate Christianity by millennia. Spirals that invoke the sun's power, crosses that mark the four directions, zigzags that represent lightning and divine energy. They bring these eggs to church for blessing, but they also bury them in their fields for fertility, hide them in their homes for protection, give them as gifts that carry wishes for health and prosperity. The priest blesses the eggs as symbols of Christ's resurrection, but the symbols he blesses remember older meanings. The egg as image of the world, the cosmos contained in a shell, the promise of life emerging from apparent death. The Christian meaning and the pagan meaning support each other like stones in an arch, each one necessary to maintain the structure's integrity. In Poland, the villagers dance around fires on St. John's Eve, June 23rd, just as their ancestors danced around midsummer fires for the sun god Svetovid. The dance steps follow patterns inherited through generations, movements that invoke fertility and protection, rhythms that connect human celebration to cosmic cycles. The dancers wear Christian crosses around their necks, but they also crown themselves with flowers and herbs that carry powers older than any saint. The fire they dance around burns herbs that grant healing and protection. St. John's wort for protection against evil, verbena for purification, mugwort for prophetic dreams. But these same herbs were sacred to pagan deities long before they became associated with Christian saints. The power flows through Christian channels but originates in pre-Christian sources. In Lithuania, the last European nation to accept Christianity, where pagan traditions survived longer and left deeper traces, the boundaries between saint and spirit remain especially permeable. The sacred groves that once sheltered altars to Pacunas the thunder god now house chapels dedicated to Saint Elijah. But the trees still receive offerings from people who understand that divine power takes many forms, answers to many names. The oak trees that survived Christianization bear both Christian and pagan symbols, crosses carved into bark that also holds runic inscriptions, icons hung from branches that also support offerings to forest spirits. The faithful who visit these sites pray to Saint Elijah for rain and protection from storms. But they also leave bread and beer for tree spirits who ruled these groves before any saint was born. The double faith flourishes here like nowhere else, nurtured by a people who converted late enough to remember the old ways clearly, who accepted Christianity without abandoning practices that connected them to the land, the seasons, the spirits that ruled their ancestors' lives. The saints and spirits share the same altars, answer the same prayers, grant the same blessings. The faithful see no need to choose between them when both offer help. Both respond to human need. Both participate in the ancient relationship between mortal and divine. In the end, dvoevry, double faith, becomes the norm rather than the exception. Across rural Europe, Christianity succeeds not by replacing pagan practices, but by absorbing them, not by destroying old relationships, but by relabeling them, not by eliminating the spirits, but by teaching them new names. The saints become the acceptable face of pagan power. The spirits learn to work through Christian channels. The faithful discover that devotion has many expressions, that the divine accepts worship in multiple forms, that truth is large enough to contain apparent contradictions. In village churches built on the foundations of pagan temples, surrounded by graveyards that hold both Christian burials and pre-Christian barrows, the faithful gather to worship saints who remember being spirits, to pray with words that echo older languages, to seek blessings that flow from sources both ancient and eternal. The soil remembers what grows in it. The stones remember what they have witnessed. The wells remember every prayer whispered over their waters. And in the rural places where life follows rhythms older than any religion, where survival depends on understanding powers both seen and unseen, the saints and spirits continue their ancient work, bridging the gap between human need and divine response, blessing the faithful who call upon them in whatever name they choose to answer. The old gods did not die. They learned new names. And in the countryside where their power matters most, where their help is needed daily, where their presence can be felt in every season's turning, they continue to answer prayers, grant blessings, and prove that divine love speaks every language the human heart knows how to use. The monastery of Sprenger echoes with the scratch of quill on parchment, the rustle of pages turned by trembling hands, the whispered prayers of monks who work by candlelight to catalogue the enemies of God. The year is 1487, and Heinrich Kramer bends over his manuscript like a scholar possessed, his eyes burning with the fever of absolute certainty. The words flow from his pen like poison from a wound. Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches. Page by page, he builds a theology of damnation. Entry by entry, he transforms the spirits that Christianity could not absorb into enemies that must be destroyed. The old gods who would not become saints, the goddesses who refused to wear Mary's gentle face, the wild powers that resisted domestication, all of them find their new names in Kramer's catalogue of demons. The transformation is methodical, surgical, complete. What once received worship now demands exorcism. What once granted blessing now spreads corruption. What once bridged the gap between human and divine now widens the chasm between salvation and damnation. Pan writhes across the pages, his goat legs dancing to infernal music, his horns crowned with flames instead of flowers. The Greek god of wild places, of untamed nature, of sexuality and ecstasy, and the madness that comes when civilization's walls grow too thin. He becomes the face of Satan himself, the adversary who leads humanity away from God's light into darkness and despair. The theological arithmetic is elegant in its simplicity. Pan's horns become the devil's horns, his cloven hooves become Satan's feet, his reed pipes become the instruments that summon demons and lead mortals into sin. His wild dances become sabbats, where witches gather to worship evil and renounce their Christian souls. The god who once blessed shepherds and their flocks becomes the demon who leads sheep astray. The deity who protected wild places becomes the enemy who lurks in forests to tempt travelers from righteous paths. The ancient protector of fertility and natural increase becomes the corrupter who teaches unnatural lusts and forbidden pleasures. But Pan is only the beginning. Kramer's pen drips with the blood of 1,000 transformations. In the forests of Germania, Frau Perchta feels the change like winter settling into her bones. She who once blessed the spinning and punished the lazy, who rewarded good children and corrected the wayward, who ruled the 12 nights between Christmas and Epiphany when the boundaries between worlds grew thin. She finds her gifts rewritten as curses, her justice recast as cruelty. The Church cannot absorb a goddess who demands such specific tribute, who slits open the bellies of lazy spinners and fills them with straw, who rewards virtue but punishes vice with a directness that makes gentle Jesus weep. Perchta is too wild, too fierce, too uncompromising to wear a saint's gentle mask. She belongs to winter's harshest truths, to the justice that cares nothing for mercy, to the natural law that demands payment for every debt. So she becomes a Christmas demon instead of a Christmas saint. Her blessing becomes a curse. Her gifts become torments. The children who once left porridge for her on cold winter nights now hide beneath blankets when they hear her footsteps in the snow, when they hear her voice calling through the wind, when they see her shadow dancing across their bedroom walls. The wild hunt thunders across the winter sky, but the riders who once carried heroes to Valhalla now carry damned souls to hell. Odin's 8-legged horse becomes a demonic steed. The Valkyries who chose the slain become banshees who herald death. The warriors who rode with the All-Father become demons who hunt the living through the longest nights. The transformation infects every aspect of the old beliefs. The elves who once blessed crops become malicious sprites who blight grain and sour milk. The dwarves who crafted magical weapons become goblins who steal children and replace them with changelings. The giants who shaped mountains and valleys become ogres who devour travelers and terrorize villages. But it is the goddesses who suffer the cruelest transformations. For their power threatens the masculine hierarchy that Christianity has built around its singular male god. Hel, the Norse goddess of the underworld, who ruled with justice over those who died of sickness or old age, who welcomed the worthy dead to her halls with the same honor as Odin's warriors received in Valhalla, she becomes the Queen of Hell, a demon who tortures souls and spreads suffering. Her realm of gentle rest for ordinary mortals becomes a pit of eternal torment. Her fair and honest judgment becomes arbitrary cruelty. The Celtic Morrigan, who appeared as crow and crone and warrior woman, who spoke prophecy and granted victory to the brave, who tasted blood on battlefields but also blessed those who fought for righteous causes. She becomes a cackling witch, a hag who flies through the night to steal children and cast evil spells. Her ravens become demons. Her prophecies become lies whispered by Satan. Her battlefield blessings become curses that lead armies to destruction. Lilith, the Mesopotamian goddess of night and storm, who ruled over childbirth and sexuality, who protected women in labor and granted fertility to the barren. She becomes the first demon, Adam's rejected wife who refused to submit to masculine authority. Her power over childbirth becomes infanticide. Her sexual freedom becomes lust that damns souls. Her independence becomes rebellion against God's divine order. The theological message is clear. Feminine power that does not submit to masculine control is demonic by definition. Goddesses who rule their own domains, who answer to no higher authority, who demand respect rather than offering submission, They cannot be tolerated in a religious system built around a male god, a male savior, and a male priesthood. But the transformation goes deeper than simple misogyny. The spirits that become demons share certain characteristics that make them unsuitable for Christian absorption. They are liminal beings, creatures of boundaries, thresholds, the spaces between defined categories. Pan rules the wild places where civilization meets nature. Perchta governs the 12 days when one year dies and another is born. The wild hunt rides during the liminal hours between midnight and dawn, when the dead can walk among the living. Christianity demands clear categories: sacred and profane, good and evil, salvation and damnation. It cannot tolerate beings who exist in the spaces between definitions, who blur the boundaries that theology requires to maintain its authority. So the liminal spirits become demons, forces of chaos that threaten the ordered universe that God created and maintains. They are also shapeshifters, beings who change form, who refuse to be pinned down to single identities, who demonstrate that reality is more fluid than human reason can comprehend. The Morrigan appears as crow, crone, and beautiful woman. Pan shifts between human and animal characteristics. The wild hunt riders change from heroes to demons depending on who sees them and when. But Christianity builds its authority on unchanging truth, eternal principles, divine laws that admit no exceptions. Shapeshifters threaten this stability by proving that identity is negotiable, that form follows function, that power can wear whatever face serves its purposes. So they must be demonized, cast as agents of deception who use their transformative abilities to mislead the faithful and spread confusion. Most dangerous of all, they are beings who grant power directly to mortals without requiring institutional mediation. Pan teaches ecstasy that bypasses priestly authority. Perchta grants justice that answers to no earthly court. The goddesses offer blessings that flow from divine sources without filtering through church hierarchy. Christianity builds its political power on the claim that salvation flows only through official channels, through priests and sacraments, through church doctrine and institutional authority. Spirits who empower individuals to commune directly with the divine undermine this monopoly. They prove that the sacred is accessible to anyone who knows the proper approaches, speaks the correct names, offers the appropriate tribute. So they become demons who seduce mortals with false promises of power, who teach forbidden knowledge that leads to damnation, who offer shortcuts to divine communion that actually lead away from God toward eternal punishment. The Church transforms their greatest threat, direct spiritual access, into their greatest crime. The demonization accelerates as Christianity consolidates its power across Europe. Local spirits become demons who plague specific regions. Household gods become evil entities that must be exorcised from Christian homes. Fertility deities become succubi and incubi who steal human seed and corrupt natural reproduction. In Ireland, the Aosi, the fairy folk who were once gods of the Tuatha De Danann, retreat underground both literally and metaphorically. They become the good neighbours who must be appeased but never worshipped, who grant favours but exact terrible prices, who live parallel to human society but represent constant temptation away from Christian virtue. The fairy mounds dot the Irish landscape like scars, marking places where the old gods went underground when Christianity claimed the surface world. The peasants still leave offerings at these sites, still speak carefully when near them, still follow rituals inherited from pre-Christian times, but now they frame their caution in Christian terms. The fairies are fallen angels, neither good enough for heaven nor evil enough for hell, trapped in earthly exile until the final judgment. The theological compromise allows continued relationship with the old powers while maintaining Christian orthodoxy. The fairies retain their functions, granting fertility, protecting households, blessing crops, punishing those who violate sacred laws, but they do so as morally ambiguous beings whose help comes with spiritual danger. In Germanic lands, the forest spirits who once protected sacred groves become demons who lead travelers astray, who cause people to lose their way in familiar woods, who whisper temptations that draw mortals away from righteous paths. The werewolves, who once served as shamanic warriors, become cursed beings who transform under Satan's influence, who lose their human souls to bestial corruption. The sacred springs that once granted healing become demon-haunted waters that must be blessed and exorcised before Christians can safely approach them. The ancient oaks that sheltered divine presence become trees where witches gather to conduct their sabbats, where demons convene to plan humanity's downfall. In Slavic territories, the domovoi, household spirits who protected homes and families, become entities that must be carefully managed rather than welcomed. They retain their protective functions, but acquire dangerous aspects that reflect Christian anxiety about domestic powers that operate outside church authority. They help with household tasks, but also play pranks that can escalate into serious harm. They protect the family but also demand tribute that resembles pagan worship. The rusalki, water spirits who once blessed rivers and lakes, become demonic entities who drown the unwary, who seduce men to watery deaths, who represent the dangerous feminine power that lurks beneath nature's beautiful surface. Their songs, which once granted inspiration and healing, become sirens' calls that lead mortals to damnation. The transformation reaches its most systematic expression in the witch trials that sweep across Europe like a plague of theological paranoia. The wise women who once served as intermediaries between human and divine communities, the healers and midwives, the herbalists and seers, the keepers of traditional knowledge, become agents of Satan who have traded their souls for supernatural power. Their knowledge of healing herbs becomes evidence of demonic pacts. Their ability to predict weather becomes trafficking with evil spirits. Their skill at helping women through childbirth becomes collaboration with demons who steal unbaptized babies. Their role as advisors and counselors becomes seduction of the innocent into witchcraft. The trials transform traditional spiritual practices into evidence of satanic worship. The seasonal gatherings where rural communities once celebrated the turning of the year become sabbats where witches renounce Christ and pledge themselves to Satan. The folk magic that helped people navigate life's challenges becomes maleficium, harmful sorcery directed against Christian society. The wise women die in flames that consume not just their bodies, but the knowledge they carried, the traditions they preserved, the connections they maintained between human communities, and the spiritual powers that governed health, weather, fertility, and the countless practical concerns that theology addresses only in abstractions. But the demonization process contains its own contradictions, creates its own spaces for the survival of pagan wisdom. The very act of cataloguing demons preserves detailed knowledge of the old gods. Kramer's Malleus Maleficarum and similar texts become inadvertent encyclopedias of pre-Christian belief, recording the names and functions of spirits that official church doctrine tried to forget. The demonologists who study supernatural evil become, despite themselves, preservers of pagan knowledge. The rituals for summoning and controlling demons often mirror the rituals that once summoned and honored gods. The grimoires that teach ceremonial magic preserve fragments of older practices, older relationships between human will and spiritual power. The very techniques that supposedly serve Satan maintain connections to pre-Christian sources of wisdom and power. The demons themselves retain their original functions even as they acquire new moral classifications. Pan still grants ecstasy and connection to wild nature, but now he does so as a demon rather than a god. Perchta still enforces cosmic justice and maintains natural law, but now she does so as a Christmas devil rather than a winter goddess. The goddesses still offer power and wisdom to those who approach them correctly, but now they do so as entities that wise practitioners must handle with extreme caution. The magical traditions that survive into the early modern period, alchemy and astrology, ceremonial magic and folk witchcraft, all preserve elements of pre-Christian spirituality under the cover of either scholarly research or diabolical practice. The scholars who study these traditions maintain connections to ancient wisdom while claiming to investigate natural philosophy. The practitioners who use them maintain relationships with old powers while accepting the risk of damnation. In some cases, the demonization backfires spectacularly. The spirits that Christianity casts as enemies become attractive precisely because they represent rebellion against established authority, alternatives to official doctrine, sources of power that bypass institutional control. The witch cults that emerge during the late medieval period, whether real or imagined by their persecutors, represent attempts to rebuild relationships with the old powers under new conditions. The practitioners who risk execution to maintain these connections prove that the need for direct spiritual access, for personal relationship with divine forces, for power that serves individual rather than institutional needs, cannot be eliminated by theological decree. Even the demons themselves demonstrate the persistence of older spiritual relationships. They respond to summoning rituals that echo pre-Christian practices. They grant powers that mirror the blessings once offered by gods and goddesses. They maintain the ancient bargain between human need and supernatural assistance, even when that bargain is reframed in terms of soul-selling rather than reciprocal devotion. The old gods live on as demons, but they live on. Their names survive in grimoires and trial records. Their functions persist in magical practices and folk beliefs. Their power continues to flow to those who know how to approach them, even when such approach carries the risk of heresy charges and execution. Christianity succeeds in driving the old gods underground, but it cannot eliminate the human needs they served. The desire for direct access to spiritual power, for personal relationship with supernatural forces, for magic that serves individual purposes rather than institutional goals. These needs persist beneath the surface of Christian orthodoxy like underground rivers, occasionally breaking through in springs of heretical practice, magical experimentation, and mystical exploration that authorities struggle to contain. The demons that Christianity creates from pagan gods become, paradoxically, preservers of the very traditions that the Church seeks to destroy. They maintain alternative spiritual practices under the cover of scholarly research or satanic rebellion. They keep alive the memory of times when humans could approach the divine directly, when power flowed through personal relationships rather than institutional channels, when the sacred was accessible to anyone who knew the proper names and offered the proper tribute. In the end, the demonization of pagan spirits accomplishes the opposite of what its architects intended. Instead of eliminating the old gods, it gives them new roles in the Christian cosmos. Instead of destroying pagan practices, it preserves them under different names. Instead of ending the relationship between humans and the spirits that once ruled their ancestors' lives, it transforms that relationship into something more dangerous, more exciting, more attractive to those who find official religion inadequate to their spiritual needs. The demons dance through Christian nightmares, but they dance to rhythms older than any church bell, older than any hymn, older than any prayer authorized by papal decree. They carry within their demonic forms the memory of times when they were honored rather than feared, worshipped rather than exorcised, loved rather than loathed. And in the shadows cast by cathedral spires, in the spaces between official prayers, in the silence that follows the last church bell's echo, they wait for mortals brave enough or desperate enough to call their ancient names and receive their ancient gifts, whatever the spiritual cost might be. In the candlelit depths of the Cathedral of Santiago de los Caballeros, Maria Rosa kneels before an altar that gleams with offerings both sacred and strange. The official saint, St. James the Greater, patron of Spain, slayer of Moors, gazes down from his gilded frame with the stern righteousness of a Christian warrior. But the woman at his feet sees different eyes looking back, recognizes a different power flowing through the carefully maintained facade. Her grandmother's whispered words echo in her memory. Santiago is Chango wearing Spanish clothes. The thunder god never died, mi niña. He just learned new prayers. Maria Rosa places her offering on the altar, not just the approved candles and flowers, but also the honey-soaked cakes that Chango has always preferred, the red and white beads that mark his colors, the small bottle of rum that will disappear before the priests make their evening rounds. She prays in Spanish to Santiago for protection and victory, but her heart speaks in older languages to the Orisha who taught humans to make fire, who rides the lightning across Caribbean skies, who remembers when his name was different, but his power was the same. This is Cuba in the 21st century, where Santeria and Catholicism dance together like lovers who have learned each other's steps so well that watching eyes cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. The revolution that promised to eliminate religion succeeded only in driving it deeper underground, where it adapted, evolved, and emerged stronger than before. The old gods learned to hide behind saints' masks, and the saints learned to channel powers older than any church. In the botanicas that line Havana's streets like prayers written in storefront Spanish, the shelves overflow with Catholic statuary that serves double duty. The Virgin of Charity, Cuba's patron saint, stands crowned and robed in blue and white, her gentle face blessing all who approach her shrine. But the practitioners who shop here know she is also Ochun, the Orisha of rivers and love, fertility and gold. Her feast day, September 8th, fills the streets with pilgrims who pray to the Virgin's compassion and Ochun's power without seeing any contradiction in their double devotion. St. Barbara's statue occupies a place of honor, her tower and palm frond marking her as a Christian martyr who died for her faith. But her red robes and the lightning bolts carved at her feet reveal her true identity to those who know how to look. She is Chango's wife, Yansa, the Orisha of storms and change, fire, and the warrior spirit that drives mortals to fight for justice. Her Catholic legend speaks of spiritual courage, but her African heart knows the taste of battle blood and the thrill of righteous violence. The syncretism runs so deep that many practitioners no longer distinguish between the saint and the Orisha, the Catholic prayer and the Yoruba song. They light candles to Santa Barbara when storms threaten, asking her to protect their homes from lightning and flooding. They leave offerings of flowers and honey at Ochun's shrine when they need money or want to attract love. They invoke Santiago when they face enemies or seek courage for dangerous undertakings. The Catholic Church officially tolerates these practices, recognizing that Cuban faith expresses itself in forms that blend African tradition with European theology. The saints work miracles that conform to Christian expectations while drawing power from sources that predate Christianity by millennia. The faithful receive blessings that satisfy both theological requirements and spiritual needs inherited from ancestors who knew different gods but sought the same divine assistance. Across the Caribbean, similar transformations preserve ancient wisdom under colonial masks. In Haiti, the LWA dance through voodoo ceremonies, wearing Catholic saints' faces, channeling powers that survived the Middle Passage and slavery and revolution to emerge in new forms adapted to new circumstances. Papa Legba, the guardian of crossroads and communication between worlds, appears as Saint Peter, holder of heaven's keys, guardian of the gates between divine and human realms. His function remains unchanged, He opens the way for other spirits to manifest, grants permission for rituals to proceed, guards the boundaries between the world of flesh and the world of spirit. But his saint's mask allows him to work openly in a Christian-dominated society, to receive worship in churches built by the very forces that once tried to destroy the traditions he represents. Baron Samedi, the LWA of death and resurrection, wears the face of various Catholic saints depending on the ceremony and the need. Sometimes he appears as Saint Gerard, sometimes as Saint Martin de Porres, always maintaining his role as guardian of graveyards, guide of souls between worlds, the power that rules the boundary between life and death. His top hat and formal dress echo European fashions, but his skull-painted face remembers African traditions, older relationships between the living and the dead. Azuli Frida, the LWA of love and luxury, beauty and desire, manifests as the Virgin Mary in her various forms. Our Lady of Sorrows, Our Lady of Mount Carmel, the Immaculate Heart. But she retains her African sensuality, her demand for perfume and jewelry, her gift for passionate love and devastating heartbreak. The Catholic prayers spoken in her honor reach ears that remember when love was a force of nature rather than a spiritual virtue, when beauty commanded worship rather than modest concealment. The syncretism preserves not just the names and functions of African deities, but also the worldview that sees spiritual power as practical force, divine intervention as everyday necessity, relationship with supernatural beings as normal part of human existence. The Vodou practitioners who attend Catholic Mass on Sunday morning and participate in LWA ceremonies on Saturday night see no contradiction in their double devotions. They understand that the divine speaks many languages, wears many faces, responds to many different types of approach. But the phenomenon extends far beyond the Caribbean, far beyond the obvious cases where slavery forced African traditions to hide behind European masks. Across Latin America, indigenous and Catholic traditions merge so completely that distinguishing between them becomes impossible. In Mexico, the Virgin of Guadalupe reigns as the nation's most beloved saint, her image reproduced on everything from cathedral altars to taxi dashboards. The story of her appearance to Juan Diego in 1531 follows Catholic patterns of Marian apparition, complete with miraculous healing and conversion of indigenous populations. But her brown skin and indigenous features, her placement on the sacred hill of Tepeyac where the Aztec goddess Tonantzin once received worship, her feast day that coincides with the winter solstice, all mark her as a Christian saint who carries the memory of older goddesses. Tonantzin, our revered mother, was the Aztec earth goddess who ruled fertility and childbirth, agriculture, and the cycles of life and death. Her temple on Tepeyac Hill received pilgrims from across Mesoamerica, offerings of flowers and food, prayers for children and crops, and protection from disease. When the Spanish conquered Mexico and destroyed her temple, the goddess seemed to disappear. But she returned wearing new clothes, speaking Spanish instead of Nahuatl, calling herself by a Christian name but retaining her ancient functions. The millions of pilgrims who crawl on their knees to Guadalupe's shrine each December 12th follow paths carved by older feet, seeking blessings from a mother goddess who remembers being Tonantzin but answers to Maria. They leave offerings that blend Catholic and indigenous traditions, roses and candles alongside feathers and corn, prayers spoken in Spanish mixed with words in native languages that predate the conquest by centuries. The Virgin's miraculous image preserves symbols that speak to indigenous eyes. Her star-covered cloak echoes the sky goddess who rules the cosmos. Her position standing on the moon recalls lunar deities who governed feminine cycles. Her pregnant pose connects her to fertility goddesses who blessed women in childbirth. The Catholic faithful see the Mother of God. The indigenous faithful see Tonantzin wearing new robes. Both receive the blessings they seek from a power that transcends theological categories. In Peru, the Lord of Miracles, El Señor de los Milagros, draws millions of pilgrims to Lima each October for processions that echo pre-Columbian religious practices. The image shows Christ crucified, painted by an African slave in the 17th century on a wall that survived earthquakes that destroyed everything around it. The Catholic interpretation emphasizes Christ's suffering and redemption, his power to work miracles and grant salvation to the faithful. But the indigenous participants see different meanings in the dark-skinned Christ, who rules over earthquake-prone land. He echoes Pachacamac, the creator god who ruled the earth's movements, who could shake mountains and reshape coastlines, who demanded tribute from mortals who built their cities on unstable ground. The massive processions that carry his image through Lima's streets follow routes that mirror pre-Columbian pilgrimage paths, ritual movements that once honored earth spirits who controlled the forces beneath human feet. The purple robes worn by the Christ image and his devotees recall the royal color of Inca nobility, the sacred hue that marked divine kingship and cosmic authority. The flowers scattered in the procession's path echo offerings once made to mountain spirits and earth powers. The music played by marching bands blends European hymns with rhythms inherited from indigenous traditions, creating soundscapes that speak to ears trained by centuries of syncretistic worship. In Brazil, the complex religious landscape includes dozens of traditions that blend African, indigenous, and European elements in combinations so intricate that scholars struggle to map their relationships. Candomblé preserves Yoruba traditions under Catholic disguises. Umbanda merges African orixás with Catholic saints and indigenous spirits. Popular Catholicism incorporates elements from both traditions while maintaining its own distinct character. Saint George, Saint Georges, appears in all three traditions, but his function varies according to the theological context. In Catholic tradition, he is the dragon-slaying knight who represents Christian victory over evil. In Candomblé, he is Ogum, the Orioxa of war and iron, fire and technology, the divine blacksmith who forged the tools that humans use to survive and prosper. In Umbanda, he leads the spiritual armies that fight against negative forces, protecting the faithful from dangers both physical and spiritual. The same statue, the same prayers, the same feast day serve all three religious communities. But each group sees different meanings in the symbols, accesses different aspects of the power that flows through St. George's image. The Catholic faithful pray for spiritual strength to overcome temptation. The Candomblé practitioners seek Ogum's blessing for work projects and protection from enemies. The Umbandistas ask for help in spiritual warfare against negative entities and evil influences. The multiplicity of meanings strengthens rather than weakens the saint's power. He becomes a focal point for diverse spiritual needs, a bridge between different religious communities, a proof that the divine responds to sincere devotion regardless of the theological framework that shapes the approach. In the United States, similar processes operate in communities where immigration and cultural mixing create new forms of religious expression. In Miami's Little Havana, botanicas sell Catholic saints and African orixás side by side, serving customers who see no contradiction between lighting candles to St. Lazarus and offering flowers to Babalu Aye, the Orisha of healing and disease who wears the saint's robes but retains his African functions. In Los Angeles, Mexican immigrants maintain shrines to the Virgin of Guadalupe that blend Catholic devotion with indigenous traditions inherited from ancestors who worshipped Tonantzin. The Virgin's image appears on murals that include Aztec symbols, in processions that incorporate native dances, in ceremonies that use sage and copal alongside Catholic incense. In New York, Dominican and Puerto Rican communities practice forms of Christianity that incorporate African and indigenous elements so seamlessly that the practitioners no longer think of them as separate traditions. They pray the rosary while burning herbs that carry ancestral blessings. They attend Catholic Mass and participate in spiritist sessions that contact deceased relatives. They honor Catholic saints and feed spiritual guides who remember being African gods or indigenous spirits. But the phenomenon extends beyond immigrant communities, beyond obvious cases of cultural blending. Throughout the American South, African traditions survived slavery by hiding behind Christian practices, creating forms of faith that appear thoroughly Christian while preserving elements of older spiritualities. The ring shouts that echo through black churches preserve dance patterns inherited from African traditions, movements that induce spiritual possession and divine ecstasy. The call and response singing that characterizes gospel music echoes ceremonial patterns used to summon spirits and maintain community connection with supernatural powers. The spiritual gifts that manifest in Pentecostal worship, speaking in tongues, prophetic visions, divine healing, continue traditions of spiritual communication that predate Christianity by millennia. The saints venerated in these communities often carry functions that echo African orishas or Native American spirits. Saint Michael becomes a warrior spirit who fights supernatural battles against evil forces. Saint Anthony becomes a finder of lost things, a power that grants practical help with everyday problems. Saint Joseph becomes a protector of families and provider of material needs, a household spirit who watches over domestic concerns. Even in Europe, where Christianity has ruled for over a millennium, folk saints preserve functions and receive veneration that echo pre-Christian patterns. In Italy, regional saints maintain territories and loyalties that mirror the local gods they replaced. San Gennaro protects Naples with the same fierce devotion that Vesuvius once showed toward the cities built in his shadow. His annual miracle, the liquefaction of his blood, draws crowds that seek his protection from earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and other natural disasters that threaten their volcanic homeland. In Ireland, St. Brigid still rules over smiths and poets, sacred wells and inspiration, maintaining the exact functions of the Celtic goddess she replaced. Her sacred fire still burns in Kildare, tended by nuns who follow rituals established by pagan priestesses. Pilgrims still visit her holy wells, seeking healing and blessing, leaving offerings that blend Christian symbols with older tokens of devotion. In Spain, regional saints maintain the territorial boundaries and cultural identities that once belonged to local gods. Santiago protects Galicia with the same intensity that Celtic war gods once showed toward their tribal territories. His cult center at Compostela draws pilgrims who follow paths established by pre-Christian traditions, seeking spiritual experiences that echo older forms of religious ecstasy and divine encounter. The survival of these patterns proves that human religious needs transcend theological categories. People require divine figures who understand their specific concerns, who share their cultural background, who respond to approaches that feel natural and authentic, rather than imposed by external authority. The saints who succeed are those who fulfill these needs, regardless of whether their power flows from officially approved sources or from older streams that church doctrine cannot acknowledge. Vatican II attempted to rationalize saint veneration, eliminating figures whose historical existence could not be documented, reducing emphasis on miraculous intervention, encouraging devotion to focus on imitation of virtue rather than requests for practical assistance. But the reforms had little impact on popular practice. The faithful continue to pray to saints for immediate help with concrete problems. They continue to offer tribute in exchange for divine favors. They continue to seek relationships with supernatural beings who function as intermediaries, advocates, and sources of power that bypass official ecclesiastical channels. The Church's attempts to control folk devotion reveal the tension between institutional authority and popular spirituality, between theological purity and practical religious need. The saints who survive official reform are those who meet real spiritual needs, who provide services that people require, who maintain relationships that satisfy deep human longings for divine connection and supernatural assistance. In the end, the folk saints prove that the old gods never died. They just learned new languages, adopted new names, accepted new job descriptions. They continue to perform their ancient functions, healing the sick, protecting travelers, blessing crops, granting fertility, ensuring justice, providing comfort in times of crisis and celebration in times of joy. They bridge the gap between official theology and lived experience, between institutional doctrine and personal spirituality, between the divine as understood by religious authorities and the divine as experienced by ordinary believers. They prove that human beings require gods who are accessible, responsive, personal, and practical, powers that understand human needs and provide real assistance with life's challenges. The candles that burn before their images carry prayers spoken in dozens of languages, seeking blessings that span cultural boundaries, expressing needs that transcend theological categories. The offerings left at their shrines include flowers and food, money and mementos, symbols of gratitude and tokens of request that echo rituals performed for thousands of years by humans seeking divine assistance. The saints listen to all of it. They respond to sincere devotion regardless of its theological sophistication. They grant miracles that conform to various religious expectations, while drawing power from sources that predate any church. They prove that the sacred is large enough to contain apparent contradictions, that divine love speaks every language the human heart knows how to use, that the gods adapt to serve human needs, rather than demanding that humans adapt to serve divine preferences. In the flickering candlelight of 1,000 shrines, in the whispered prayers of millions of believers, in the offerings left by hands both wealthy and poor, the old gods continue their ancient work. They have learned to hide in plain sight, to work through acceptable channels, to grant their blessings through intermediaries that church authorities can approve. But their power remains unchanged. Their compassion endures. Their willingness to help mortals navigate the challenges of existence continues unabated. They remember their original names, their ancient functions, their prehistoric relationships with human communities that sought their blessing and received their protection. The saints smile from their icons and statues, wearing Christian names and Christian symbols, conforming to Christian expectations and Christian doctrine. But behind their painted eyes, older powers watch and wait and respond to the eternal human need for divine assistance, supernatural protection, and the comfort that comes from knowing that we do not face life's challenges alone. The old gods live on, hidden in plain sight, disguised as saints, but retaining their original hearts, their ancient wisdom, their timeless commitment to helping mortals find their way through a world that is beautiful and terrible, sacred and profane, filled with wonders that require divine assistance to navigate safely. The old woman's hands shake as she lights the candle, her fingers gnarled by decades of work but still steady enough to hold the flame without burning the wick. She kneels before an icon that hangs in the corner of her kitchen, where cooking smoke has darkened the painted wood, and countless prayers have worn the word smooth from repeated whispering. The face in the icon might be St. Nicholas, bearded patriarch, protector of children, gift giver who brings joy to the darkest season. Or it might be the older gift giver, the one who rode 8-legged horses through winter skies when the world was younger and the boundaries between realms were thinner. The woman who prays does not worry about such distinctions. She needs help with her grandson, who coughs blood and grows thinner each day, despite the doctor's medicines and the family's desperate love. Holy Father, she whispers in Russian that carries accents older than Christianity. Protect the child. Heal what is broken. Guard what is precious. The candle flame wavers in the draught from the kitchen window, dancing like a living thing, casting shadows that move across the icon's painted features. For a moment, just a moment, the eyes seem to shift, the mouth seems to smile, the hand seems to move in blessing. the old woman feels warmth flow through her chest, peace settle in her bones, certainty rise in her heart that her prayers have been heard by someone who has the power to answer them. Does it matter whether that someone wears the robes of a Christian saint or the furs of a pagan god? Does it matter whether the power that flows from icon to believer travels through orthodox theological channels or streams that predate any church? Does it matter what name she uses when the divine responds to the need in her voice, the love in her heart, the faith that burns in her prayers like the candle flame that lights her kitchen? The question echoes through 2,000 years of religious transformation, through the ruins of pagan temples and the rising walls of Christian churches, through the shadows where old gods learn new names and the bright spaces where saints remember being spirits. It whispers in the wind that carries incense from cathedral altars and smoke from offerings left in forest groves. It dances in the candlelight that illuminates both Christian icons and older symbols, both saint shrines and spirit houses, both the official theology that dominates the daylight hours and the folk practices that flourish in darkness. In the universities where scholars pass the differences between syncretism and authentic faith, between cultural adaptation and theological corruption, the question takes academic form. How much can a religion change while remaining itself? When does Christianity cease to be Christianity and become something else entirely? At what point does the absorption of pagan elements transform the faith into a hybrid that dishonors both traditions it claims to represent? But the old woman lighting candles in her kitchen does not care about academic distinctions. She cares about her grandson's cough, about the fear that keeps her awake at night, about the desperate human need for help from powers greater than mortal understanding. She prays to whoever will listen, whoever will help, whoever has the compassion to heal a sick child and the power to make that compassion effective. The religious studies professors who map the transformations of European spirituality understand the historical processes that turn spirits into saints, gods into Christian intermediaries, pagan festivals into church holidays. They can trace the evolution of religious symbols, document the migration of mythological motifs, analyze the political and social forces that shaped theological development across centuries of cultural change. Dr. Sarah Mackenzie publishes papers on syncretistic elements in medieval hagiography, tracing how St. Bridget's legend incorporates motifs from Celtic goddess mythology. Professor Johann Weber writes books about the transformation of Germanic paganism in early Christian texts, documenting how Thor's attributes were transferred to St. Michael. Dr. Elena Volkov researches Slavic folk religion and Orthodox Christianity, mapping the persistence of pre-Christian practices in officially Christian communities. Their scholarship illuminates the historical processes, but it cannot answer the existential question: do the prayers work less well when the saint remembers being a spirit? Does divine power flow less freely when it travels through syncretic channels rather than theologically pure ones? Are the miracles less miraculous when they manifest through figures whose biographies blend historical fact with mythological fiction? The anthropologists who study living religious communities see the answer in the lives of believers who inhabit the borderlands between traditions. Dr. Maria Santos documents how Puerto Rican Catholics pray to saints who function exactly like Taino spirits, seeking the same types of assistance through identical ritual approaches. Her interviews reveal believers who experience no conflict between their Catholic identity and their indigenous practices, who see both traditions as authentic expressions of the same underlying spiritual reality. Dr. James Morrison studies Irish pilgrimage sites where Christian saints have inherited the exact locations, feast days, and miraculous powers of Celtic deities. His ethnographic work shows how modern pilgrims approach these sites with devotions that blend Christian prayer with pre-Christian ritual, seeking healing from springs that have granted the same blessings for thousands of years under different names. Dr. Anya Petrov researches contemporary Russian Orthodoxy in rural communities, where saints and spirits share the same altars, respond to the same prayers, grant the same types of blessings. Her field notes describe believers who maintain elaborate household shrines that honor both orthodox icons and older protective figures, who see no contradiction between official church doctrine and traditional practices inherited from grandmothers who remembered when the spirits had different names. The data suggests that the theological distinctions matter far less to practitioners than to authorities. The believers who seek divine assistance care more about effectiveness than orthodoxy, more about results than doctrinal purity. They pray to whoever answers, honor whoever helps, trust whoever demonstrates the power to improve their lives in practical, measurable ways. But the question has psychological dimensions that complicate simple, pragmatic answers. The neo-pagan movements that have emerged across the Western world in recent decades represent attempts to recover pre-Christian spirituality, to restore relationships with gods and goddesses who have not been filtered through Christian theological interpretation. In the forests of Oregon, covens gather to honor Diana as a goddess of the hunt rather than a saint of the forest. They seek to experience her power directly, without the mediating influence of Christian symbols or theological frameworks. Their rituals attempt to recreate pre-Christian practices, to approach the divine through methods that predate syncretistic adaptation. But they discover that restoration is more complex than revival. The gods they seek to honor have been shaped by centuries of Christian interpretation, their mythologies filtered through medieval texts written by Christian scholars, their symbols preserved in art created by Christian artists. The authentic paganism they seek to practice never existed in pure form. It was always local, specific, embedded in cultural contexts that cannot be fully recovered or accurately recreated. The Celtic reconstructionists who attempt to honor the Tuatha Dé Danann discover that their knowledge of these deities comes largely from texts written by Christian monks who preserved pagan mythology by transforming it into Christian allegory. The Germanic heathens, who seek to worship Odin and Thor, must work with sources that were recorded centuries after the conversion, filtered through Christian assumptions about proper religious practice. The Norse practitioner who pours mead at Odin's shrine may perform exactly the same ritual as her medieval ancestors, but she does so as an act of conscious religious choice, rather than inherited cultural practice. She approaches the god as an individual seeking personal spiritual experience, rather than as a member of a community whose collective survival depends on maintaining proper relationships with tribal deities. The transformation changes the nature of the religious experience, even when it preserves the external forms. Odin, honored by isolated modern practitioners, functions differently than Odin, honored by entire Germanic tribes whose identity was inseparable from their relationship with their gods. The god remains the same, but the human context has changed so dramatically that the relationship itself becomes fundamentally different. Meanwhile, in rural Ireland, St. Bridget continues to receive offerings at wells that have been sacred for millennia. The pilgrims who visit these sites may not know that Bridget was once a goddess, may not care about the theological history of their practices. They simply know that prayers spoken at these wells receive answers, that water from these springs grants healing, that candles lit for St. Bridget protect families from harm and grant blessings that improve their lives in tangible ways. The power flows through Christian channels, but it may originate in sources that predate Christianity. The saint provides an acceptable name for an ancient relationship, a theological framework that allows the continuation of practices that authorities might otherwise suppress. The believers receive genuine spiritual experiences that satisfy their religious needs while conforming to social expectations about proper Christian behavior. From this perspective, the transformation of spirits into saints represents not the destruction of paganism, but its successful preservation under changed circumstances. The gods survive by adapting, by accepting new names and new ritual forms. by working through institutional structures that provide protection from persecution, while maintaining access to human communities that need their assistance. But the transformation exacts a price that some observers find unacceptable. The wild gods of pre-Christian Europe embodied aspects of existence that Christianity struggles to accommodate: sexuality and violence, ecstasy and madness, the darker aspects of nature that resist domestication or moral categorization. Pan's sexuality becomes suspect when he wears a saint's robes. The Morrigan's battlefield fury fits awkwardly into Christian frameworks that emphasize peace and forgiveness. Thor's violent protection of humanity conflicts with theological emphasis on turning the other cheek and loving one's enemies. The saints who inherit the functions of these deities often lose their edge, their wildness, their connection to the untamed aspects of existence that shaped pre-Christian spirituality. Saint Michael fights spiritual battles against abstract evil rather than physical battles against concrete enemies. Saint Bridget presides over domesticated hearth fires rather than the wild flames that consume sacrifices and illuminated ecstatic rites. The transformation tames the gods, makes them safe for civilized consumption, removes the dangerous elements that made them powerful but unpredictable allies. The saint who cannot grant victory in battle is less useful than the war god who demanded tribute but delivered conquest. The goddess who cannot curse enemies is weaker than the deity who blessed friends and destroyed foes with equal passion. The psychological studies of religious experience suggest that humans need access to the full spectrum of divine power, including aspects that civilized society prefers to suppress or deny. The gods who embody rage and lust, violence and chaos, death and destruction, serve psychological functions that gentle saints cannot fulfill. Dr. Carl Jung's research on archetypes identifies divine figures as projections of psychological patterns that exist in all human consciousness. The warrior god represents the aggressive impulses that civilization constrains but cannot eliminate. The trickster deity embodies the creativity that emerges from breaking rules and challenging authority. The death goddess symbolizes the destructive forces that clear away the old to make space for the new. When these archetypal patterns are filtered through Christian theology, they lose their psychological effectiveness. The warrior becomes a soldier in God's army rather than a champion of personal honor. The trickster becomes a teacher of moral lessons rather than an agent of creative chaos. The death goddess becomes a saint who intercedes for gentle passage rather than a power who demands that mortals face mortality with courage. The saints provide socially acceptable outlets for religious impulses, but they may not satisfy the deeper psychological needs that drove humans to create gods in the first place. The believer who needs divine assistance with practical problems, protection from enemies, success in love, victory in competition, may find that saints offer comfort, but not the fierce advocacy that pagan gods provided to their faithful followers. But the evidence from living religious communities suggests that many saints retain more of their original power than theological authorities acknowledge or approve. The folk saints who flourish in communities where official doctrine carries less weight than traditional practice often demonstrate the wild characteristics that their official hagiographies suppress. Santa Muerte, the Mexican folk saint of death, grants protection to criminals and outcasts, helps in matters of violence and revenge, assists with magical practices that official Catholicism condemns. Her devotees approach her with offerings and requests that would scandalize conventional Christians, but she responds with effectiveness that proves her power transcends theological categories. The Virgin of Guadalupe manifests in visions that include political messages, healing miracles that defy medical explanation, and interventions in situations that involve conflict, sexuality, and other aspects of human experience that official Marian theology handles with extreme delicacy. San La Muerte in Argentina grants favors that include revenge against enemies, protection for criminals, and assistance with activities that official Christianity condemns. His devotees understand that he operates outside conventional moral categories, that his power flows from sources deeper and darker than church doctrine acknowledges. These folk saints preserve the dangerous edge that theological authorities try to eliminate from official saint veneration. They demonstrate that the divine retains its capacity for moral ambiguity, its willingness to assist with human needs that respectable religion prefers to ignore, its power to intervene in situations that require more than gentle blessing and holy comfort. The philosophical implications extend beyond psychology into fundamental questions about the nature of divinity itself. If gods and saints perform identical functions, grant similar types of assistance, and respond to comparable forms of worship, what does this suggest about the relationship between human spiritual need and divine response? The perennialist philosophers argue that all religious traditions access the same underlying spiritual reality through different cultural forms. From this perspective, the transformation of spirits into saints represents not theological corruption, but cultural adaptation. The same divine powers working through whatever symbolic systems allow them to maintain relationships with human communities. Aldous Huxley's concept of the perennial philosophy suggests that mystical experiences across cultures point toward identical spiritual truths that transcend the theological frameworks used to interpret them. The Celtic Druid who experiences divine communion in a sacred grove, and the Christian mystic who encounters God in a cathedral may access the same transcendent reality through different cultural doorways. The saints who remember being spirits may channel identical divine forces through evolved symbolic systems. The power that flows from St. Brigid's well may be the same power that once flowed from the Celtic goddess's spring. The healing that manifests through St. Michael's intercession may originate in the same source that once granted victory through Thor's blessing. If this interpretation is correct, then the question of names becomes irrelevant to everything except cultural politics. The divine responds to sincere spiritual need, regardless of the theological language used to express that need. The gods adapt their manifestations to whatever forms allow them to maintain effective relationships with changing human communities. But the traditionalist philosophers argue that form and content cannot be separated so easily, that different theological frameworks create genuinely different spiritual experiences, that the transformation of spirits into saints represents real loss rather than mere cultural adaptation. René Guénon's critique of modernity emphasizes that authentic spiritual traditions require intact symbolic systems that preserve original meanings without dilution or distortion. From this perspective, the saints who replaced pagan gods are pale shadows of their predecessors, theological constructs that lack the spiritual power and psychological effectiveness of the deities they claim to represent. The Celtic goddess, Brigid, honoured by druids who understood her connection to the forces of fire and inspiration, creativity and craft, possessed spiritual authority that Saint Brigid, venerated by Christians who emphasize her humility and obedience, cannot match. The transformation preserves some external characteristics while destroying the essential spiritual core that made the original deity effective. This analysis suggests that the survival of pagan elements in Christian contexts represents not successful adaptation, but gradual decay, the slow death of authentic spiritual traditions under the weight of foreign theological assumptions that distort their essential meanings until they become spiritually ineffective. The debate continues in academic conferences and scholarly journals, in monasteries and meditation centers, in the hearts and minds of believers who struggle to understand their own spiritual experiences and the traditions that shaped them. But beyond the theoretical discussions, in the candlelit spaces where people pray for help with immediate problems, the practical question receives practical answers. The candle burns before the icon. The prayer rises from human lips to divine ears. The answer comes in whatever form the believer can recognize and receive: healing for the sick child, protection from threatening forces, guidance through difficult decisions, comfort in times of loss, and celebration in times of joy. The old woman in her kitchen does not know whether Saint Nicholas or Odin hears her prayers. She does not care about the theological purity of her devotions or the historical accuracy of her saint's biography. She knows that her grandson's cough has improved since she began lighting candles and whispering prayers. She knows that peace has replaced anxiety in her heart, hope has replaced despair in her thoughts. The response to her prayers validates her faith regardless of its theological framework. The improvement in her grandson's health proves that someone with healing power listened to her requests and chose to help. The comfort that fills her heart demonstrates that divine compassion responds to human need without regard for doctrinal sophistication or religious credentials. From her perspective, the academic debates miss the essential point. The divine works through whatever channels allow it to reach human hearts and provide the assistance that those hearts require. The saints who remember being spirits serve as bridges between divine power and mortal need, translating cosmic forces into human terms, making the infinite accessible to finite understanding. In the end, perhaps the question itself reflects human limitations rather than divine preferences. We create categories, pagan and Christian, authentic and syncretic, orthodox and folk, because our minds require organizational frameworks to process complex information. But the divine may operate beyond such categories, responding to genuine spiritual need without regard for the cultural forms that shape human religious expression. The gods may not care what names we use when we pray to them. They may not distinguish between the offerings we leave at pagan altars and Christian shrines. They may respond to the love in our hearts rather than the theology in our heads, to the sincerity of our need rather than the correctness of our doctrine. The old woman blows out her candle and rises from her knees, her prayers complete, her heart at peace. In the darkness of her kitchen, the icon's painted eyes seem to watch over her with compassion that transcends theological boundaries, with love that speaks every language the human heart knows how to use. Tomorrow, she will light another candle, whisper another prayer, seek another blessing from the divine power that has protected her family for generations. She will call that power by whatever name feels most natural, most authentic, most likely to receive a favorable response. The power itself will listen with the same compassion it has always shown, respond with the same generosity it has always demonstrated, prove once again that divine love adapts to serve human need, rather than demanding that humans adapt to serve divine preferences. The saints smile from their icons, wearing Christian names but remembering older titles, conforming to theological expectations while retaining ancient powers, bridging the gap between what we think we need and what we actually receive from sources that may be older, deeper, and more generous than any human doctrine can fully comprehend or contain. In the end, perhaps it does not matter what we call them. Perhaps it only matters that they answer when we call.